Welcome to our opening panel for this inaugural Religious Liberty Summit. Thank you all for being here. This panel, we're going to be discussing the important topic of overcoming polarization in the context of religious liberty. And we have a really fantastic all-star group here to discuss this important issue with us. I'll introduce our panelists in the order in which they'll be providing their opening remarks. And then after that, we're going to move to some Q&A discussion. Asma Uddin is an Inclusive America Project Fellow at the Aspen Institute, where she is leading a project on Muslim-Christian polarization in the US. Ms. Uddin was formerly legal counsel at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, and she has held fellowships at Georgetown, UCLA, and Brigham Young University Law School. She's an expert advisor on religious freedom to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She is the author of When Islam is Not a Religion, Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom, and The Politics of Vulnerability, How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations in a Post-Christian America. For this latter book, Asma is also the award winner of the Notre Dame Annual Religious Liberty Scholarship Prize, and she's going to be doing a book discussion tomorrow afternoon with Emma Green from The Atlantic, and so we encourage those of you available to go sit in on that. Justin Giboney is an attorney and political strategist in Atlanta, Georgia, who leads the AND campaign and is the co-founder and president. The AND campaign is a coalition of urban Christians who are determined to address the socio-political arena with compassion and conviction of the gospel. He has experience managing successful campaigns for transportation and water infrastructure. A former Vanderbilt University football player and law student, Justin served on the Urban League of Greater Atlanta Board of Directors. Additionally, Justin has participated in Lead Atlanta, Outstanding Atlanta, and the Georgia Bar Association's Leadership Academy. Reverend Marion Edmonds-Allen is the executive director of Parity, a New York City-based national nonprofit that works at the intersection of faith and LGBTQ concerns. And she is the director of Blessed by Difference, a project that seeks to promote curious and collaborative bridging across the LGBTQ+ and faith divide. Marian has worked with youth and families in various denominations and settings throughout the country for more than 20 years, focusing on strength-based interventions and support to affirm beliefs and faith practices for LGBTQ people. In 2013, Marian was named the Person of the Year by Q Salt Lake for her visionary leadership, and in 2015 was named a Petra Fellow for her work with LGBTQ+ homeless youth. She is formerly the executive director of Outreach Resource Centers, the National Program Director of the Family Acceptance Project, and Executive Director of the Utah Pride Center. Marian attended Western Theological Seminary and Eden Theological Seminary and has served in many pastoral capacities, including church planting, parish ministry, and chaplaincy. She is married, she has 4 beautiful children, and she is a passionate skier and an outdoor enthusiast. John Inazu is the Sally Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion and Professor of Political Science by courtesy. John Inazu's scholarship focuses on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, and related questions of legal and political theory. His books include Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, and Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. Inazu is a special editor of a volume of law and theology published in Law and Contemporary Problems with co-editor of Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. His articles have appeared in a number of law review articles, and he has written broadly for mainstream audiences in publications including The Atlantic, USA Today, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. Prior to law teaching, Inazu clerked for Judge Roger L. Woolman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit, and he has served 4 years as an Associate General Counsel with the Department of Air Force at the Pentagon. With that, we will turn the time over to Asma to offer some opening remarks.
Thank you, Stephanie, and the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Initiative for inviting me to present today. The topic, overcoming the polarization of religious liberty, happens to be the subject of my recent book, The Politics of Vulnerability, and indeed a lot of my other work these days. I assess the interconnectedness of various culture war battles being fought in the religious liberty space. If I were to describe those battles broadly, I'd say they pit conservative, mostly white Christians against a range of marginalized minorities. The list of minorities includes LGBTQ individuals and Muslims, among others. My book, the subtitle of which is How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations in a Post-Christian America, looks specifically at the Muslim-Christian divide. I talk about LGBTQ issues because I think any discussion of a politicized religious liberty necessarily must address those issues. But my focus is really on the cultural war battle between conservative Christians and Muslims. I offer an analysis of what's going on there, and then I offer solutions, much of which are based on this idea that we have to stop berating conservative Christians for their traditional religious beliefs if we want to move forward. Over at the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., where I am a fellow, we call this the Politics of Vulnerability Framework for Engagement, and it's all about lowering perceptions of threat. My framework was inspired after I went on tour with my 2019 book, When Islam is Not a Religion. In that book, I describe in detail the many challenges facing Muslims' religious freedom in the US, at the core of which is this idea, often stated explicitly, that Islam is not a religion and that therefore Muslims do not have access to religious freedom. The problems are very real, from nationwide protests against the construction of mosques, to mosques being burned down, to sharp rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes, and so on. Unfortunately, what I also learned in my research and through my personal interactions is that many of the folks who support and even drive these attacks are very concerned about their own religious freedom. Many of them are Christian, and a large subset of those are evangelicals. This should come as no surprise, since we also saw lots of polls and analyses during the Trump era about evangelical support for his policies, including, for example, the travel ban against individuals from numerous Muslim-majority states. Now, this background to my framework is really important to understand. My framework for healing is rooted first and foremost in a clear recognition of the problems in religious freedom politics. I am driven by a need to protect a very marginalized minority, and I'm looking for effective ways to do that. This is important to understand because attempts at civility are often denigrated as weak, or as selling out, or even as morally wrong, because they choose to compromise instead of confront people who are considered beyond the pale. So I've centered a marginalized, powerless minority, but I take a very different approach to the problem. My goal, in the words of interfaith civic leader Ibu Patel, is to speak of marginalization without exacerbating polarization, and to speak of polarization without papering over marginalization. That is, we can talk about the very real struggles of the marginalized without being hateful toward those we think are the ones marginalizing them. In this way, then, the Muslim-Christian divide is a case study that can help us figure out solutions for other kinds of divides too. Part of the reason I take this approach is because of my many personal experiences with conservative white Christians who are kind and generous and deeply devout to their faith in a way that is frankly inspiring. These sorts of interactions have shown me that there's nothing given about the Muslim-Christian divide. We're not dealing with a monolith that we can cast as uniformly evil or deplorable. Instead, there are careful distinctions to be made, people to be in community with. And the other reason I do this is because I think it's more effective at solving the problems I see. I also think it's just the right thing to do, to bring people together instead of driving them further apart. So in my analysis, I set out to look at the very human dynamics at play. I'll refer you to the book for details on my approach, but the basic pieces are, first, group identity. Our group is the in-group, and those outside our group are the out-group. Our attachment to our group is so significant that loyalty boosts self-esteem. On the flip side, studies have shown that if we're isolated from our group for whatever reason, the stigma acts on us psychologically and also triggers a physical assault on our body. What this means in practice is that even evolutionarily, humans are programmed to signal their allegiance to their tribe as a way of avoiding the loneliness and stress that comes with being cast out. Then there's a dynamic of intergroup bias. That is, when the in-group feels threatened, it lashes out. White evangelicals are experiencing tremendous anxiety in the phase of seismic demographic and cultural changes. Consider three major shifts. First, white preponderance is on the decline. In 1965, white Americans constituted 84% of the US population, And now Pew says whites will be a minority by 2055. Second, in 1996, white Protestant Christians still made up 2/3 of the population. Today, they don't even constitute a majority. And third, the demise of white Protestant America has brought with it an end to the cultural and institutional world built primarily by white Protestants. Today, these trends have led conservative white evangelicals to feel under siege. And just as studies and intergroup bias predict, that vulnerability is being turned against the outgroup. And then there's a phenomenon of mega identities, which I explain in the book. Our identities today include a wide array of things, everything from what we eat and drive, where we live and shop, and what our religion or race or sexual orientation is. And of course, whether we're a Democrat or Republican. And that's a really important piece of this partisan element. The way that so much what we say and do and believe are now a function of whether we're part of Team Red or Team Blue. Socially and politically, all this gets grouped together. We group hybrid driving, latte drinking, Whole Foods shopping Americans into the Democratic Party and the Land Rover driving Cracker Barrel customer into the Republican Party. This grouping has also affected religious communities so that Christians, mostly white and conservative, are associated with the Republican Party, and religious minorities, particularly Muslims, are associated with the Democratic Party. The ramifications of such groupings are serious. When one tribe opposes the other, it opposes the full range of quote unquote traits that are a part of the opposing mega identity. So if a conservative is going to oppose liberals, he or she is also going to oppose Muslims because in this mega grouping, Muslims and liberals are lumped together. In the book, I take all of these different pieces and I fit them together to show how today, many Christians who value faith and religious freedom use it to protect only their own interests. I call it the in-group shield and the out-group sword. In today's political and legal culture, many Christian conservatives feeling under siege think of religious freedom as a way of protecting their own interests, and that protection somehow to them requires taking it away from the Muslim outgroup. And then I explore ways of healing that divide. Understanding the social psychology involved in the Christian-Muslim divide makes clear that healing requires disrupting the mechanisms of outgroup hostility. Outgroup hostility results when the in-group feels threatened. As such, to counteract the hostility, strategies for healing must focus principally on reducing perceptions of threat. The idea is to help facilitate real transformations for all involved. The goal is not winning or reaching resolution. We have to make people feel heard, even when we have significant differences with them, and even as we continue to hold on to our differences. It's not an easy or intuitive process, but we have to find ways to do it. So the goal is not reaching agreement on every complicated issue. Instead, the goal in my particular experiment is to change how Muslims and evangelicals across the religious and political divide engage with one another in order to build common community. To that end, I explore strategies like self-affirmation, empathy, superordinate goals, unsorting, and so on. I talk about how, for example, helping people to self-affirm the good parts of their identity helps prevent destructive ideologies that are rooted in low self-esteem. I explain that seeing others as humans with human needs and fears is key to helping people feel less threatened. I talk about how groups that oppose each other can often work together if they have a goal that both are dedicated to, and I propose religious freedom as that goal. And finally, I emphasize intra-religious diversity that I think can help us unsort ourselves so that we're not lining up religious identification with particular political tribes. In the end, again, the premise of my approach is a realization that we're all human, and the more we can focus on that and not on presenting each other as a dehumanized evil other, the closer we can get to finding effective solutions. If the ultimate goal is to make sure those who are powerless and marginalized are protected, then we need to think outside the box and focus on strategies that work. Thank you.
Good morning. I am honored to be here this morning with these distinguished panelists, and I thank the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Summit for the invitation. You'll hear a lot of the same things as Asma have. We did not conspire, but you'll hear a lot of the same themes in these conversations. Call it one of American history's ugliest ironies. A country founded in part on the pursuit of representation and religious freedom condoning, and in some instances, sanctioning the denial of religious freedom and representation for certain people. This is perhaps the defining battle of the Black religious and political experience in America, a storyline of survival despite constant attempts to deny human dignity and agency. The earliest version of the Black church was forced to be an invisible institution, as Albert Rabateau coined it in his book, Slave Religion. He explains how enslaved people were forbidden from attending church and even praying. To pursue real religious experience was to risk corporal punishment. Literacy and therefore Bible reading were prohibited, likely because the Bible's liberation narrative has always been a threat to injustice and moral disorder. And yet somehow the church survived as a clandestine institution, becoming a life source and refuge where many slave preachers professed a theology of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, a hermeneutic of love and truth that distinguished itself from the slaveholders' perverted version of the faith, constantly reminding the shackled congregation that they were defined by God, not by the institution of slavery, that their chains were temporal, but their freedom inevitable. Despite church bombings and segregated pews, the Black church experience is ultimately a testimony that couldn't be contained. It's about a praise and worship chorus that couldn't be silenced. Conversely, it's a reminder of man's inability to subvert the providence and plans of God. It's a glorious reminder of the fact that there are some things you can't beat out of a people. You see, true faith is always beyond the tyrant's reach, but unfortunately, its free exercise is not. You see, religion robs the tyrant of ultimate authority. It means that there are some matters that transcend the jurisdiction of heads of state and the cultural consensus. So the tyrant, which could be all of us, always seeks to dismantle and neutralize or co-opt it. But there will always be a song that refuses not to sing, a praise that's determined to reach the heavens. This explains why an enslaved people in the midst of a system designed to produce nothing but hopelessness and self-hate somehow found a way to sing freedom songs and to love their own soulful aesthetic. This explains why a people bound to a wicked institution designed to produce nothing but beasts of burden, yet they somehow become poets and theologians, inventors, orators, and playwrights. Thank God the Black church has always had a song that refused not to sing, a praise that rang out through the muzzle of oppression to miraculously reach the heavens. And here we are now, drawn into a culture war not of our own making, but nevertheless with our interest in the survival of our institutions at stake. Not faultless, but also not equitably represented in the exchange. You see, the Black church is not a monolith, but the large number of us who value social justice while refusing to be lured by the false promises of self-definition and self-justification find it difficult to fully align with either side of this war. Though we primarily vote with Democrats, neither the conservative nor secular progressive storylines are all that convincing, to be honest. One of these traditions got the entire civil rights movement wrong. The other battles in vain against absolute truth, and this leaves many of us conflicted, but one thing's for sure, we're never insulated from the consequences of their altercation. We've always paid not only for our own sins, which are present and real, but also for the sins of whoever's winning the culture war at the moment. James Davison Hunter, the sociologist who coined the term culture war, noted that the cultural conflict in this country took place primarily within a sector of white America. Now, it's diversified a bit. You now see CRT as part of the conversation, but the Hidden Tribes report showed that today's polarized debates are still controlled by affluent whites on both sides of the ideological spectrum. My organization and the hundreds of Black and brown pastors who stand with us has decided that it's past time for us to enter into this conversation, whether we're given an invitation or not. And thankfully today we've been given an invitation and we appreciate that. We have decided to stand for religious freedom for everyone, not just for Christians, and for things like LGBT rights, not surrendering our convictions or splitting the baby, but rather demonstrating that it's not a winner-take-all proposition. We've resolved to apply the compassion and conviction of the gospel to those who disagree with us and agree with us alike. One of the keys to depolarizing religious freedom is to listen to people of color who aren't vested in the old ideological wars, but have an interest in the outcome of the religious freedom dispute, and then to reconstruct the conversation based on those insights. Try following leaders like Asma Uddin or Ambassador Johnson Cook, who have a different framework and different approach to the issue. The debate would automatically become less partisan and more constructive. Majority Americans, who primarily define themselves through the lens of conservative or progressive ideology, don't have a lot of credibility with the other side. So rather than waiting for the other side to be bludgeoned out of existence, overcome the impasse with different inputs and by following diverse leaders. We need each other. Everyone has a role to play, but the frame and tenor of the discourse can no longer solely be driven and orchestrated by white conservative and white progressive sensibilities and historical beefs. I'm not talking about diversity for the sake of diversity. I'm talking about diversity for the sake of democracy and a discourse that can be constructive and effectively come with solutions. The traditional Black church's public witness provides a probative and compelling example of how to disagree and fight for freedom without contempt. It's a song that refuses not to sing, with notes and lyrics worth reciting and living out. God bless you.
It's my honor to be here today and to be with this distinguished panel. And I'm grateful for the opinions and thoughts I've heard so far. And I'm grateful for those of you that I've met. My name is Reverend Marion Edmonds-Allen. And as I say often, I'm a person that scares people. When I speak in faith settings and wear my collar and people don't realize that I'm LGBT, and I out myself and say, I'm a non-binary, bisexual person married to a woman, I can kind of watch the ripples in the audience. And when I speak to LGBT audiences and I'm not wearing my clerical collar and they don't know that I'm a pastor, and I out myself as a person of faith and, oh my goodness, a clergy person, I can watch the same ripples go through the audience because people are worried about what I might say, what that might mean. We've been conditioned by what we see in the media or what we hear or see on social media about the LGBT and faith divide, that it's two things that can never come together. And yet here I am, I'm both. I'm this human bridge. I didn't come to this early in my life. I was 40 years old and working as a hospital chaplain before I met my very first LGBT person. I grew up in rural Maine. I never knew anyone that was LGBT. And I grew up as an evangelical person. I went to Gordon College. My faith was then, as it is now, very important to me. So when I met my first LGBT person, I'll be honest, my world was rocked. I didn't know how to react. And then I thought, well, as a pastor, I need to know how to relate to everyone. I need to get to know all people. And my CPE supervisor at the time could kind of tell, I think, and facilitated a conversation where I realized over a course of months that that was who I was. And I went back to my seminary, Western Theological Seminary, and talked with my advisors about it and was told, well, you should perhaps lie about that and hope no one ever asks you. And I thought, well, if this is my journey with God, this is my journey with God. And I left Western Theological Seminary, my Reformed Church in America roots that are still a part of me, and went to Eden Theological Seminary and the United Church of Christ, where there's a different attitude about LGBT people and clergy and ordination. I still wasn't sure how I felt about faith and being LGBT. And it's been kind of a struggle throughout my life. And when I was invited to go to Salt Lake City, Utah to plant a church, I said yes, because I wanted to work with youth experiencing homelessness. So we started a church, and then we started bringing food and supplies to about 60 youth experiencing homelessness around Salt Lake City. They lived in abandoned buildings and camps. One lived in a tree outside of Temple Square, if you can believe that. And what I found from meeting these youth and listening to them was a very deep faith. These were youth that many of them, half of them, had been kicked out of religious homes for being or appearing LGBT. And yet they had this unshakable faith in their journey with God. Each of them carried a journal where they would write prayers, and they would write about their talks with God, and they would draw pictures about their faith. And I found that as I tried to advocate for these youth who couldn't access shelters in the state at that time because of the law, that I had rallies. I was quite the activist at the time, but I wasn't getting anywhere. And it wasn't until I met a woman named Laura, who was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who said to me, well, Marian, I don't believe there are homeless youth, not in Utah. And I said, come to my center. At this point, I was running a youth center. Come to my center, meet some. And she did. She met a 12-year-old boy who was there collecting socks and canned goods. He had a backpack. Laura and I were standing and talking next to the shelves with the canned goods, and he kept putting canned goods and trying to be secretive about it. But Laura noticed, and Laura chatted with him and asked about him and said, well, why do you need all that food? Well, the story was he, like so many homeless youth, lived with a family of 10 other youth, and they lived in a camp, and his job was to go find food. And there he was. And Laura, at that moment, her heart broke open. She knew that there were homeless youth in Utah. She just met one. And she also knew that this was a youth that was cold because he was in a t-shirt and it was November. So what she did was she went back to her church. She called up her friends, and they got together and decided they would find some coats. Well, the next week, an 18-wheeler flatbed drove into this little church parking lot in Ogden, Utah, could barely fit, covered with hundreds and hundreds of warm coats. Because of Laura's faith, she knew that she had to get coats for youth. And because of the faith of all the other people that she knew, they also wanted to help. Laura and I became friends, and Laura was also a legislative aide. So Laura said, we need to change this law. And she called up her friends in the church and in government. And lo and behold, the law in Utah changed so that unaccompanied youth can access shelters and not have to sleep out in a canyon or in a tree. Laura and I are friends to this day. One afternoon, we were waiting for an interview, and I looked over at Laura. We were sitting in her car because we were early. We're, early birds. And there were tears streaming down her face. And I said, Laura, my dear friend, what's wrong? And Laura said to me, Marian, I need to tell you something, and I'm worried it will end our friendship. And I said, Laura, please tell me. And she said, Marian, I don't agree with same-sex marriage. In my faith, it's not okay. It's a sin. And I said, Laura, I know that. I know that about you, and I love you just the same. And Laura said to me, Marian, I love you too. And I love Tori. And I said, I know. This doesn't change our friendship. In fact, it deepens it, because we can be exactly who we are with each other. We can respect each other's faith and have a relationship based on love. That, to me, is religious freedom. We can come together and love and respect each other deeply. Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation to join you, and I've been delighted to hear my fellow panelists today. I'm going to sort of do a couple of framing comments before we get to a discussion, and really three thoughts. They all start with C: compromise, critique, and celebrate. I know many of you who know me are shocked that I'm not saying confident pluralism is one of the C's, but let's think about compromise, critique, and celebrate. Compromise, to me, religious freedom in this country is fundamentally about compromise. And Justin said a minute ago, it doesn't have to be winner take all. That's right, but that also implies that everybody loses a little bit. And I think in our partisan wars and framing around some of these issues, we're not willing to think about what true compromise and true sacrifice might mean. And actually, when you think about the heart of what all civil liberties are, and religious liberty included, it's a kind of compromise. We don't have a theocracy precisely because we allow dissent and difference and different kinds of religious practices over things that really matter. And the only way to finally and fully figure out how to live together is through a kind of compromise. That doesn't mean compromising your beliefs or your fundamental convictions, but it does mean a kind of political compromise. Second point, critique. There are a lot of people that are against any form of compromise. I would say most of those people populate Twitter, especially. I'm reading a book now by the Duke sociologist Chris Bale, breaking out of the social media prism, that's making some really important points about how our differences are amplified on social media, especially Twitter, how actually breaking out of the echo chamber isn't going to do it, because when we break out of an echo chamber toward more partisan voices, we actually increase our own partisan convictions. So the method and the means of de-echoing the chamber is as important as trying to do it. And it's going to be hard to do over social media. And that means we have to be clear about the critiques we make, particularly the critiques of our own team. We're reticent to critique our friends and our allies when they step out of line, when they refuse to compromise. But the key to overcoming polarization will include some willingness to critique our own. So I think about, on the right, the white evangelicals that Asma was talking about, who do not tolerate religious freedom for everyone, who are actively out to suppress the rights, especially of American Muslims and others. There have to be, from white evangelical leaders, a critique of those voices, and a strong critique of those voices, even at the expense of mutual platforms and friendships at some point. There are Republican elected officials who are actively against religious freedom for all, and there have to be critiques of those as well. There are progressive organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the ACLU that are not fundamentally for religious freedom for all, and progressives on the left need to critique those for the sake of compromise. I think especially of the ACL's move against expression and religious expression in the anti-abortion context, the shocking move from Hill against Colorado in 2000 to McCullen a decade later, and the need for true advocates of civil liberties, including religious freedom, to critique even when it's the same team. And finally, the importance of celebrating. We need to celebrate the wins. And here again, I think about the social media context where nobody likes to listen to nuance and nobody likes to listen to compromise. And yet that's fundamentally key to the success of civil liberties. So we need to celebrate those voices, including the ones we've heard this morning. Celebrate the stories that are nuanced, that are surprising, that are sometimes very ordinary, and figure out how to support each other in the midst of this. Asma mentioned Ibu Patel a few minutes ago, a friend of mine, Ibu, who's a progressive Muslim, and I, as I would hesitate to say evangelical because that term's sort of loaded, but that will situate me a little bit. And as a Japanese American, we go around the country talking about religious freedom and religious pluralism. What's not to like about that? And yet we've also been protested off of campuses together, and we've met with some hostility, even to the basic message of religious freedom and religious pluralism. And so I think it's important to celebrate the voices that are trying to do the more ordinary work of suggesting compromise, of suggesting the importance of religious freedom for all. We're not going to get there on Twitter, so we need to start doing this more in person. And I would encourage all of us to listen better to each other, to be more charitable in our understandings of each other. There's a 4C, but as a somewhat Protestant person, I need to stick to 3 only. So I'll end there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for those fantastic remarks. I'm going to pose a series of questions that are going to be aimed at some of the specific panelists. So, John, I'm going to start with you. So we'll go in reverse order. Are there any lessons you think to be learned from the Supreme Court's recent unanimous decision in Fulton when it comes to overcoming polarization of religious liberty? And what might some broader lessons be about how we can overcome sometimes conflicts that the media makes seem so intractable? And what are ways that we can find more common sense solutions?
That's a tricky question with 110-page concurrence to think about, but I do think there are some lessons from Fulton. Rick Garnett has written about the importance of unanimity in this decision and others. And I do think when there are issues where if you read social media commentary prior to these opinions, you would think there's no way you would ever get a unanimous opinion. And yet here we are on these issues. And this has happened more than once in recent cases. I think the Supreme Court is looking for ways to move toward compromise when legislative bodies appear not to be able to do it. David French has a piece on this after Bostock and the ministerial exception case Morrissey Baru that I think is on point about the court trying to structure and broker a sort of compromise. Whether they'll be able to do it as a matter of legitimacy, as a matter of public cultural understanding remains to be seen. But I think there are some lessons that we can all see in the lengthy Fulton opinions about what might be coming.
Thank you. Reverend Marian, you've spoken a little bit about how sometimes there can be concern or discussion amongst different groups with strong different views on theological issues. So can you speak a little bit more about how you think there is opportunity for collaboration and overcoming polarization, even with deep theological divides? And what would you say to someone who is worried that having these sorts of conversations means that your ultimate goal might be to change their theology on an important issue like their beliefs about traditional marriage?
That's a wonderful question. That's a question I'm asked most often is ultimately, Marian, you want to change my theology, don't you? And that's furthest from the truth. I mean, we all are working on our own relationship with God. The way I answer that question is I'm working on my own theology with fear and trembling with God. And I respect that each person has their own journey with God. I believe that we need to lean into our own religious beliefs and to look for those religious beliefs in others and listen carefully and with curiosity. Because meeting someone who has a very different opinion than me theologically about LGBT or anything else, I always learn something. I learned something that helps deepen my own faith, and it transforms me as a person. I welcome those conversations. And I think the way to help overcome this polarization is like the story that I told earlier about Laura, that if we work together, particularly across difference. So if we have a different opinion about a particular issue, one person will know a lot about one side of it. One person will know a lot about the other side of it. Think about forming a team around that. And religious freedom to me is the perfect example of an issue that can bring all people together. If we can work across our difference, not just despite our difference, but because of them, oh, the things that we can do in the world.
A question for both Justin and Asma. We've talked about how until fairly recently, in some ways, the Black church and the Muslim community haven't been able to be as full of participants in some of these discussions about religious liberty. And so I'm curious if you could speak to ways in which this is an evolving issue, Justin, for the Black church, and Asma, if you could then speak to that same issue for the Muslim community.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, this religious liberty isn't a conversation that's been had a lot in the Black church. As I noted in my talk earlier, we haven't really been part of the dispute. I think that's for a few different reasons. One, we had a lot of other things to worry about. So whether it be criminal justice, voter rights, and so on, that's where our concentration was, because it seemed like a more immediate threat when you talk about education, poverty, and all those things. But I also think because of the culture war, it became a white evangelical really battle. And because that's usually on the opposite side of the kind of political spectrum from us, just not something that we entered into. But thankfully, because of the work of some of the people in here, I mean, Ambassador Johnson Cook, Dr. Jacqueline Rivers, the Black church is starting to get into this conversation in earnest. Myself and those two and a bunch of other Christian leaders, Black Christian leaders, signed a document in regard to the Equality Act to say, hey, this is something that we want to step up and talk about, and we're going to talk about it on our terms. And we're going to make sure that it's framed in a way that's true to what we believe, where we maintain our convictions, but also maintain our compassion. And if there's a need for repentance or a need for lament, then we ought to do that. And I think that's very important, because sometimes when you do see people of color entering into the conversation, it's really just regurgitating what one or the other side is saying. And it's not authentic in the ways that it needs to be. But I look forward, because of the great leadership, the Black church really becoming part of this conversation, and an important part of it, because while many of us have a lot of conservative beliefs, we also have some political power in the Democratic Party, which kind of changes the dynamic.
Thank you.
Yeah, once again, I'm not surprised that Justin and I are thinking along very similar lines, and our experiences are so similar despite the fact that we're talking about such different communities. So in the book, I talk about the sort of traits of these different political mega identities and the way that we sort of line up against this full array of traits. And even though my focus there is largely on the way that a lot of conservative white Christians line up against Muslims and the championing of Muslims' rights as a trait of a liberal mega identity. And if anyone has any sort of doubts about that, just think about some of the imagery at the Women's March that happened soon after former President Trump's inauguration. And the fact that one of the main posters there was it was actually a version of Obama's Hope poster with a Muslim woman in a headscarf. And it was also one of the four leaders of the march was actually a Muslim woman in a headscarf. And so the imagery there was so clear that Islam, and specifically this Muslim woman in a headscarf, what became a symbol of anti-Trumpism. And then there's plenty of other data to support this idea that Muslims have essentially been conflated with the Democratic Party. Of course, the flip side of that is, how do Muslims think of white Christians, white conservative Christians? And it's the same sort of tribal opposition. And it's been aided by the fact that many people on the political left, those are the primary voices speaking up in defense of Muslims' rights. When Muslims are suffering, and the FBI has documented that the fastest rate of fastest growing rate of hate crimes is actually religious hate crimes are against Muslims, for example. And we've seen plenty of cases, except for example, after the first announcement of the first version of the travel ban, where there are a series of mosques that were burned down across the nation within just a couple weeks span after that. So these things are real. And oftentimes, unfortunately, when I'm with conservative groups, there's sort of a dismissiveness about it, that like, oh, Islamophobia is just another form of political correctness. It's just a way of the left kind of silencing us and policing our speech. Whereas many people on the left do have an authentic dedication to those issues. And so when the Muslim community sees that, again, it's just 1% of the population, often dealing with lots of very public hate against it. And so it's easy for many people in the community to think, well, this is the political tribe to align ourselves with. But one thing that I note both in this book and in my last book, which is called When Islam is Not a Religion, which focuses not just on this phenomenon of people on the right claiming that Islam is not a religion and therefore Muslims don't have religious freedom, was also the phenomenon on the left, where so much of this championship often happens in a version where Islam isn't really a religion, it's really kind of a race almost, or ethnicity, and Muslims are defended as such. And so it was a realization kind of coming out of that. I'm not questioning any sort of sincerity in the way people deal with these things, but just really critiquing the frames and the way that Islam and Muslims have become proxies for this much bigger ideological war in this country, and what that means ultimately, even including what happens at the Supreme Court and the way some of those things are interpreted in the media. And so even as I'm analyzing this, I'm also seeing increasingly that scholars and other activists in the Muslim community are also beginning to feel a little bit uncomfortable and understand that there's sort of this proxy phenomenon is happening, and are demanding more opportunities to speak more authentically for what Muslims are worried about.
Thank you. That's so important. I'm going to ask a question of all the panelists now, and I'll start with you, John, and we'll come down the line. But I'm curious if you can speak to, areas where folks across the political spectrum or different faith communities try and come together to find more common ground when it comes to religious liberty, and maybe have in mind an audience that isn't just legislators or folks involved in passing bills, but what are some common sense solutions, ways that more everyday Americans or people in this audience can find those opportunities to advocate for others and to advance this broader principle of religious liberty in nonpartisan ways?
Yeah, I think it starts with something Marion was saying earlier about the importance of actual friendships with real people and focusing on not stereotypes, but embodied human beings, which works best at the local level. So the practical takeaway for everybody here is to work on a kind of friendship that reminds you that common ground in the day-to-day doesn't actually often involve your deepest convictions. It's about helping homeless youth, which should not be controversial. It's about repairing roads and having better schools and looking to restore the social fabric around you. And I think that if more of us can work toward doing that, that's a good practical first step. And the other thing I would say is get offline.
No more Twitter is one of John's takeaways. Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is education, number one. Even just civics 101. What made this country great, right? It was some of the ideals. Even if we didn't obtain many of them, it was the ideals that we had, that we could have deep differences, not these small things that nobody cares about. I mean, you wouldn't have to protect religious freedom if it was just about things that nobody cared about. It's about things that people really care about. And that's why it needed to be protected. And so I think that education of helping people really understand what that means, because I think we've lost the reason and the ideals that gave this country the potential to get better. So that's one of the big ones. And then I think, we can talk all day, but a lot of times it's about advocacy. And that's one of the reasons that the AND campaign and the folks who are standing with us wanted to advocate for something like the Fairness for All Act. Rather than just saying, we're sorry to our LGBT brothers and sisters that we disagree, but we're sorry for what happened in the past, to actually say, no, I'm going to do something about it. I'm not only going to, push the church to make sure that they're protecting folks who they may, again, disagree with that are in that community, but actually advocate that the laws be changed to do that. And I think it's that step that really helps out, because we can talk a lot, we can fellowship, but at what point are we willing to change what we advocate for and even risk something of our own to make sure people who we may differ with are protected? And I think that's what can make this country better, and really the ideals that set us apart in some ways.
Thank you. Asma?
Yeah, I would echo the point about education. For me, so much as polarization is about what people's perception is of what, for example, is going on in a particular case. Many of Supreme Court decisions are talked about in the media in often very simple terms, often very using culture war frames. But I have found in my own interactions, whether it be in small groups or in front of larger audiences, that when I kind of get into the actually what's at stake and what the court actually said and the principles at stake and the way that those principles can be applied to other religious groups, there's a total turnaround on the way that people are understanding these cases. So I think some understanding of that. And then in my book, what I really set out to do was I explain the mechanics of polarization. So political polarization generally, and then religious polarization specifically. And it was an educational process for me too, just doing that research and finding the frames and the terminology to explain this phenomenon that I saw very clearly happening in front of me. And then to understand, once you understand how it works, you become mindful in the ways that you can make sure that you don't fall for it, right? And so, so I would say mindfulness is a huge part of it. Understand what's going on, and then just be careful about the things that make you mad. Take up the issues that truly make you mad, as opposed to the things that others just want you to be mad about.
And also, if I could just ask you one quick follow-up question on that. You were talking about writing about Supreme Court cases. Do you mind just summarizing briefly for the audience? Like, you had written some op-eds about the Fulton case. And so just some of your points about how this Supreme Court case that seems like such a culture war issue in some context doesn't need to be viewed that way.
Sure. So I have, this bigger phenomenon, which I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, of like the way this polarized battle is thought of is essentially, in a nutshell, conservative white Christians against like this whole list of marginalized minorities. And this is like the fundamental divide. And my contribution, again, is I'm not explicitly trying to, it's not about taking sides. It's about just saying, well, let's just take a moment to see if that's actually true. And if everything that you think comes out in favor of conservative white Christians is also necessarily positioned against minority rights. And so my contribution there is to show, look, these various sort of principles and these different things that the court decided ultimately will also protect religious minority rights. And so just offering that example. And my recent op-ed in the USA Today, a couple of them actually, one that came out before predicting the outcome and the one that came out after, shows first how some of the jurisprudence is fundamentally was originated and was developed in cases involving religious minorities. And then the one that came out afterwards, the piece that I wrote was just explaining specific minority cases in which the holding would be relevant.
Thank you. Reverend Marian?
That's a brilliant point. Often I find that folks will just kind of skim the headlines and then have an idea of what a particular ruling means and not realize that there's so much more to it. For example, the Hobby Lobby case, which you brilliantly outline in your book, there's so much more than, oh, women's rights are under attack. No, there was a common sense solution that happened that people mostly don't know about. So education, absolutely. The other thing we can all do is to make a friend with someone very different from us. And that's something that we all can do. Think through your Rolodex of people that you know. Think about issues that you worry about or think about, and then find someone that you can talk to about that issue. I have friends who are very different from me in every way, who I reach out to and say, can you explain this to me? I'm hearing about it in the news and I don't understand it. And my friend Derek will patiently explain it to me. And then, aha, I have those moments. So make a friend.
Excellent. Thank you all. For just one closing question, there's a lot of issues domestically that seem to create conflicts that could be difficult or sometimes seem intractable. But one thing that I'm hopeful of is that one area of shared collaboration or common ground is also looking at some of the international issues taking place dealing with religious freedom, where religious freedom protections are literally a matter of life or death for different religious communities, as we're going to hear more about tonight with remarks from Commissioner Nuri Turkel. But I'm curious if our panelists can speak to that area as one where we can have more common ground, more collaboration, more cooperation amongst groups who they may, for very principled, good reasons, not agree on things like whether or not we should have fairness for all or other sorts of legislation. But is this an area where we could find more unity and more opportunity to work together on these issues? Reverend Marian, I'll start with you and then we'll come this way.
Yes, absolutely. International religious freedom is, to me, the least known, best kept secret of a beautiful way forward in the world of human dignity for all. I am blessed to work with a group that operates on the principle of covenantal pluralism. And that means that despite their very different religious beliefs and non-belief, they work together for human rights around the world. And I talk to my progressive colleagues about this and say, you're concerned rightly about LGBT people around the world and their threats to their very lives. The international religious liberty movement is the very best way forward in terms of human dignity and human flourishing for all people.
So I would say mostly yes. My introduction to the world of religious freedom happened through international religious freedom. I spent my first couple of years touring the world, working on issues of, for example, blasphemy acts in places like Indonesia and Pakistan, where my parents are from. And so I was pretty much not aware of, I think religious liberty at that time was not as politicized as it is now, even in domestic context, but certainly there was a consensus among people, among advocates from a range of groups across the political spectrum on what needed to be done there. I think today I think that's changing to some extent. I was fascinated when I read recently about this phenomenon of Islamo-leftism being talked about in France, and the way, for example, top officials in the Macron's government are talking about how universities had essentially imported this phenomenon of Islamo-leftism, which is considered part of critical race theory, from American universities, and were positioning themselves against it. And of course, having written this book and I was looking at this, I was like, well, this is kind of what I'm thinking about is in the dynamics in the United States about how Islam and the left are conflated. So I think some of those culture war issues, those complex issues are showing up.
I think to some extent you also saw it in a recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur, Ahmad Shahid, where he also wrote about the conflict between LGBTQ rights and religious freedom, and took a position on it that I think a lot of religious liberty advocates disagreed with. So I think mostly yes, but not entirely yes.
Sure, there's some nuance there. Justin.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Nigeria and you know, it's too many parts of the world, people need to know about it. We need to be educated, and we need to do what we can to make those changes. I mean, these are children and women and men that are really suffering. And because sometimes when we look across the world, it's not as polarized. This conversation that is a good one to start with, knowing that we shouldn't allow it to not force us to deal with what we have right here and the issues that we really need to dig into today. Because I think a lot of this starts with the true understanding of what pluralism is. I think you have certain groups that really take it for granted because they hadn't needed to be pluralistic. And now it's like, well, everybody matters and we want religious freedom now because we're not in the same place of power. And then I think when you come to the left, sometimes pluralism is thought of as anything, as long as it comes to a progressive conclusion, then it's okay, right? But that's not what pluralism is, right? It's not a bunch of different flavors or avenues to progressive conclusions. It's people with deep differences that say, you know what, we can find ways to live together like we saw happen in Utah. And so, yeah, we need to have those conversations about what's going on in other places. I think they can be helpful, and those people need help. I think that's the basis of it. Making sure that we deal with what we need to deal with here to be an example and to have the credibility to go to other places as well.
Thank you. And speaking of pluralism, we'll conclude with the man who wrote the book about it.
Well, I think in the international context, I would go back to my second C, which is critique. And critique, even when it's against interests, we're sitting here in a powerful and important university. I work at one as well. And across the country today, many of these universities are partnering for financial reasons with governments that are not supporting religious freedom, that are torturing and murdering people because of their faith. And until we get serious about critiquing even against interest, then a lot of our platitudes, I think, about the importance of international religious freedom are going to fall short.
Thank you. So this panel has been super impressive, not only because they all ended their remarks on time, but because this was a fantastic substantive discussion on such an important issue that will continue to be one that we'll think about. Join me in giving them a round of applause. All right, there will be a 15-minute break, and then we will resume with the panel on religious liberty in the press here at 11:15 a.m.
Remarks. I think you have the additional questions at the bottom. I'll call her. We were supposed to switch the questions. I think she was first. Oh, but everything else. Okay, yeah. And sometimes. Yes, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Do you have, did you see the videos I sent you? I'll check that out. Okay. Do you have an order that you want people to send?
Sound test. Sound test.
Where'd you travel from?
All right.
Oh, very good. We're just in Fort Wayne, so we didn't have to come far. Yeah, but I'm visiting.
We're running
family
slightly
even closer, so it
over
was
time.
very easy.
So I'll ask you just come and take your seats here and we'll get going. No. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. The previous panel was just superb. Thank you to Notre Dame for hosting this panel, which I'm quite excited about religious freedom and the press. We have a distinguished group with us, and we'll jump right in giving them introductions and their introductory notes. We have Mrs. Gretchen Crowe, who is the editorial director of Our Sunday Visitor periodicals. And she's also on the liaison committee of the Catholic Press Association and the Catholic News Service, and we're grateful to have her with us today. We have Miss Elizabeth Dias, covers faith and politics for the New York Times. Some of us have heard of that publication. She is joining us via Zoom. You can see her overhead. And so welcome, Elizabeth. Prior to the Times, she was also Time Magazine. She is a graduate of Wheaton College and the Princeton Theological Seminary, and the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including being a finalist for the Livingston Award this past year. Miss Emma Green is a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine, where she writes on politics and policy and religion. In 2019, she was the recipient of no less than 3 first-place awards from the Religious News Service Association. And in 2020, she receives the George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Excellence in Journalism, Arts, and Letters. Mr. Eric Marrapodi leads NPR's live coverage of special events team, including covering the 2020 election. We'll remember that one. Before that, he served as a senior editor and producer, both with Morning Edition at NPR, and then previously in his work at NBC News and CNN. My name is Hal Boyd, and I'm the executive editor of the Deseret News. I'll just give a brief plug here, shameless plug for Deseret Magazine. And a reason to plug it is Dr. Jacqueline Cook Rivers, who will be in our next panel across the way there. She has a superb piece in this issue, and I've left copies by the doors for those who are interested. Please take it and read it. She does an excellent job, as do the others who've participated in that issue of the magazine. Well, we have this wonderful opportunity to explore the interconnected web between religious freedom and the freedom of the press. And there's not much that separates the two. The free exercise clause is only separated from the freedom of press by a few words. They happen to be the freedom of speech, and a semicolon and a comma. And so there's a natural affinity between religious freedom and the press, a natural linking and bridging. And so we're excited to have this discussion. We'll begin by having remarks, and they'll go in the order of Ms. Crowe, and then we'll have over broadcast Ms. Dias, and then we'll have Ms. Green, and then Mr. Marrapodi, in that order. And we'll begin with the prompt in mind, with the question of both how would these individuals describe their role in the press, describe their unique position and responsibility, and then secondarily, what is distinct about their role and their position that they have in their various media entities. We have newspaper reporters, we have magazine writers, we have radio producer, editors. So we have an eclectic group, different platforms and media properties. And so we're excited to hear what they richly bring to our national discourse regarding religion and other matters. So we'll give it to Ms. Crowe first.
Good morning. Well, first, let me say what an honor it is to be here and to be a part of such an important discussion. It's interesting that I'm going first because my perspective is really quite a bit different than that of my esteemed fellow panelists. I'm very honored to be here to share it with you. As editorial director at Our Sunday Visitor, I oversee America's only weekly national Catholic newspaper. And it's my job to report and provide analysis and commentary on the church, yes, but also to do so with a clear and unapologetic mission of serving Jesus Christ and the church that he founded. So like all in media, hopefully, our goal is the truth, but it is a truth personified for us. It's a truth that's grounded in the teachings of the carpenter from Nazareth and solidified by 2,000 years of tradition. We're at a conference this week to talk about religious liberty. And without this constitutional protection, much as with the freedom of the press, my vocation would look quite a bit different. It is the role of Catholic media to both form and inform. We analyze the issues of the day through the perspective of the church, and we seek to articulate what the church teaches and why. This can be on something as seemingly mundane, but not, as the church proclaimed year of St. Joseph that we are currently in as a church. This may be, use the word mundane, it may be mundane to secular audiences. It's certainly not as to the church. Or it could be on something as significant as the Supreme Court's recent ruling on the protection of religious freedoms of the Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia and how it handles its own foster care. So Catholic media is an essential tool for not only providing the who, the what, and the where of the event that's taking place, but on providing the why. And this goes really to the biggest why of them all. Why are we human beings here on this planet anyway? The church has the answer, we believe firmly, and Catholic media, faithful to Christ's mission to go out and make disciples of all nations, seek to advance that message. We are here to know and to love God, to seek to do his will, and to one day join him in heaven. That's what we're all about. And that's what has to remain the foundation of any faithful Catholic media outlet. Catholic media also seeks to fill in the gaps and sometimes, yes, even correct information that our secular counterparts, for one reason or another, may have misinterpreted or misrepresented. Our Sunday Visitor did quite a bit of reporting, for example, on the recent vote by the US bishops to draft a teaching document on the Eucharist. There was a lot of nuance and perspective and context that we were able to bring to the story that secular journalists weren't able to or weren't willing to for one reason or another. Covering the Catholic Church, after all, is just a part of a religious beat for secular reporters. For us, it's part and parcel of our mission, and that gives our content and our perspective great value. So, as a member of Catholic media, what do I look for in a story? I look to provide clarity through a lens of faith on the significant issues of the day, be it racism or immigration or life issues or gender issues. We tell the underreported stories, like the good work being done by dioceses across the country in service to the mission of the church, or the stories of the individuals being considered by the church for sainthood. We tell the inspiring stories of men and women who have responded to the Lord's call and as a result have borne great fruit in the mission of their vocations or in their ministries. We seek to share a perspective all too often lost in secularized culture, such as on the meaning of suffering, on the importance of prayer, or on the dignity of the human person. We work to serve Christ in the church, which is the same thing as serving the truth, which should be the goal of any good media outlet. That's why the Catholic media exists, and it's what shapes our content and what drives our mission. This is certainly true for Our Sunday Visitor, which was founded in 1912 by a country priest in Indiana during a time of great anti-Catholicism. Our Sunday Visitor became a voice for the truth and in service to Christ and his church, and our mission remains so today. Thank you so much.
Elizabeth, if you can hear us, you can go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me virtually, and I wish I could be with you all. Thank you to Notre Dame for hosting this event. And I am talking to you from Washington, D.C. today. I'm the national religion correspondent for the New York Times, and I guess there's many things I could say about my role. I mean, the coverage is it's enormous. I mean, I joke sometimes that religion is both the best beat and the craziest beat, because we have entire politics desks and desks for all different agencies of the government, and often the religion reporting teams can be quite small, and yet our work really matters personally, politically, culturally to every person in the world. And it's an amazing beat because we get at meaning making, which is especially important right now, given the great turmoil that the country is in. And most of I'm on the national desk, so my work is mostly US focused, although obviously religion transcends borders. So we get at a lot of broader themes, but we do everything from hard news to feature stories to enterprise to investigations, and so the form of the story can take a variety of shapes depending on the news. And the main themes, I would say, of the coverage this year this sort of era right now, I'm really focused on the themes of the divided country, and this big question of really, where are we going? Where are we going at this time in history? Where are we going as a nation? Where are different religious communities headed? This is a time of great change, of increasing secularization, of demographic changes in the United States. And how do all those themes intersect? I mean, it's everything from the January 6th siege on the Capitol, and the role of hard right Christian groups, and including people like the Proud Boys, who were invoking the name of Jesus before they went into the Capitol, to, as was just mentioned, the Bishops' Conference this last week, or also the Southern Baptists in Nashville. And so there's great range, but one of the biggest things that I've been thinking about in terms of what my unique role is and what the role of the New York Times is. I mean, of course, we're here, one of our slogans is "The truth is worth it." And it all comes back to establishing what are facts, which is, up for grabs these days, like what actually happened, what actually did not happen, and how do those things interact with one another. But even beyond that, I think a lot about writing for history, because the New York Times is, in many places, the paper of record, and increasingly not just for the United States, but for the world. And I have learned so much by going through the archives of the paper and seeing how different topics were covered at different times in history. And I'm very aware, as are my colleagues, that we are writing history's first draft that will be used by historians and archivists and religious leaders and Americans and people across the world in the future, to understand, how did society understand who it was at this time? What were the major debates going on? And how did that, change? Because, you have daily stories, then you have stories that take, months of investigation. And at this time, when society is increasingly polarized, hostile, facts are up for grabs, the role of media is under great scrutiny and questioned by a lot of people. What will stand is this historical record. And sometimes I can get overwhelmed by the enormity of the coverage, to be honest. And in those moments, I just say, what is important to write down, not just for people who are alive now, but in the future? And not everyone will agree with what we choose to write down. But that is the role of the institution, I think, of the New York Times. It's not just what I'm doing, it's what all of my colleagues are doing, and how we think of the body of coverage, not just an individual story. And that has been one of the things that's kept me going. So I don't need to tell all of you, it's been a crazy year and a half, 5 years. And so that sort of through line for me about the truth being worth it and this role for history is probably my through line in how I see my role right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here in South Bend. I've not had the opportunity to visit Notre Dame before, so this is quite a privilege. I'm Emma Green. I am a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine, where I cover politics, policy, and religion. And being at a general interest magazine, I think affords me certain privileges that certainly distinguishes my role from Gretchen or from Elizabeth, certainly from Eric, who we'll hear from next, in that I get to be somewhat more selective in the stories that I tell. We stay in the news cycle, we cover stories of the day, but we also try to pick our shots based on stories that can really illuminate different challenges, complicated problems. We try to pick stories that have really strong characters and narrative, which sounds a little strange when you're thinking about the news or real life events, but using those tools, we try to really bring people deep inside of big stories to try to further understanding. In my role as a religion reporter, my favorite stories are those that illuminate the tensions within religious communities. People who feel a mutual stakeholdership or commitment to one another, who nonetheless have disagreements over who they are, what their public witness is going to be, where they line up on major issues of the day. I find that those stories of internal tension are actually often much more illuminating than the kind of stories that we often encounter of culture wars, of one group pitted against the other, of the left pitted against the right. Because ultimately, I think people who have commitments to one another around a certain set of shared values and yet feel differently about certain issues have more of a stake in good faith debate, good faith conversation, and trying to build towards something. But in the context of this conference, the religious liberty context, that can often be hard to achieve because, as many of you lawyers know, religious liberty cases, especially those that get the most press and reach the highest courts of the land, often do involve parties of extremely different worldviews and very different values with completely counter claims coming against one another in a court of law and trying to get their conflicts resolved there. So in the religious liberty context, how do I think about my coverage? My favorite stories that I've done about religious liberty are trying to find some complications that often don't come out in the coverage. I was blessed to have an editor who really seriously and eagerly wanted me to do a feature story on RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which for any religious liberty lawyer, you know that that's a statute that most often comes up for the Justice Department. It comes before the Supreme Court all the time. It's the root of many, many, many conflicts in townships around the country. And yet we don't hear about it that often because it's often about involves topics that people find boring, like town zoning meetings and different ordinances that aren't really sexy and have that sort of culture war flair. I was able to do a feature story on this about a church in New Jersey that had been mired in what you could call bureaucratic purgatory, for lack of a better word, for several years. And as a result, had lost millions and millions of dollars having to pay rent on multiple facilities. Telling that story, I think, opened doors to reach audiences and people who normally wouldn't necessarily expect to find themselves or their communities in pages of The Atlantic. But my all-time favorite commenter happened on that story in the comment section below the article. Rick Warren, who is the pastor of Saddleback Church in California, who is probably one of the most famous pastors in the country, actually commented like, a regular everyday Joe and said, "Hey, this happened to my church. I really recognize this story. Thanks so much." Which I just thought was really interesting and funny that story about a statute that a lot of regular people don't think about could open doors and make connections that coverage otherwise might not do because it feels alienating or polarizing. So, in this context, that's one play, but there are only so many editors in the world who want so many features on RLUIPA. You can only kind of sell that once in a reporter's lifetime. So, how do I then try to tell stories that I think illuminate more than obscure or bring people in more than alienate them? And I would highlight 3 values that I bring to coverage around religious liberty, certainly, but more broadly, the stories that I try to do. One is trying to introduce complication, telling stories in their fullness with nuance in a way that doesn't have easy villains and heroes, that tries to bring multiple perspectives and tries to really help readers understand points of view that they otherwise might not be inclined to seek out or to identify with. The second is, with limits, to tell stories with empathy. So to try as best as I can as a reporter within the bounds of accuracy and truth and fact to understand these stories as human stories. As many religious liberty litigators know, stories that end up at the Supreme Court get turned into these abstractions about case law and history, but in the end, they're stories about litigants. They're about human beings who have come into conflict with other human beings. And I think trying to lift up those human elements and understand the human story behind those elements is a way to open up coverage and make it more accessible, relatable, and even inviting for people who otherwise might be turned off by one perspective or the other. And the final quality, which I think is by far the most important for me and for all journalists across different forums, is fairness. And fairness looks different to different people. As Elizabeth was mentioning, the press has come into a lot of criticism. Certainly, I have had stories that people have thought were wrong or biased, or the liberal media or the conservative media, whatever it might be. To me, the ethos that has to animate all of my writing is, am I being fair? Am I giving each person who is a voice in this story, each perspective, a fair shot to articulate their point of view? And when they read my story, are they going to recognize themselves in the story that they read? Or is it going to depict an alternate universe that they've never been to? I really, really value that ethic of fairness. And it's asymptotic. It's a pursuit that's really hard to achieve because on the one hand, journalism is a business of recording facts, but as you all know, facts can become very slippery very quickly. So I think journalism, I was talking about this just a few minutes ago with an attendee here, journalism is a labor that's more akin to woodworking than anything else. It's just slowly, slowly chipping away at stories, trying to produce something that's recognizable and useful to other people. And I hope that some of my work can do that, and that, again, it will illuminate more than obscure. Thanks so much for having me here.
Hi, I'm Eric Marrapodi, batting cleanup today on the panel. It's great to be here. I had my doubts as to whether or not I'd be here. I, like many of you, have spent the last 15 months in my basement trying to master Zoom, the delicate art of muting oneself, turning off the video, and screaming at your children who are upstairs not on virtual school like they're supposed to be. I would wish Zoom kindergarten on no other person in the future of our great world. I work at NPR. That's my job. That's what I do. I'm in charge of live special programming, breaking news, things that are happening, and planned events like elections. It's been a great privilege to work at a place like NPR. It's a public media organization that's dependent on member stations buying our programming and folks like you sponsoring those member stations at home at your local radio station level. And there's a great difference between that and some of the other jobs I've had in the past. Hal mentioned I worked at NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, running all things politics in DC out of the Washington Bureau, working with a lot of great correspondents, producers, and editors, and also spent a decade at CNN, where I launched the Belief blog, which is probably the reason why I'm here, where we covered all things religion and the intersection of news. That has been a great thing for me personally in helping to understand the role that religion plays in our everyday lives, and particularly in breaking news. When I was a kid growing up in Providence, Rhode Island, the great state of Rhode Island, I considered myself Catholic by proxy because everyone else in Rhode Island is Catholic, and we were the Protestant family growing up. And when I looked at the media and saw how religion was covered, I thought there was an extraordinary bias against religion. And what I learned after I went to college and got a few jobs in newsrooms was that it was not a matter of simple bias, but rather ignorance. That people just didn't know what the stories were. They didn't understand how religion played into things. So one of the things I did on my own was I realized if my faith tradition as a Protestant had been so maligned and misunderstood, there was a good chance that everyone else's was too. So I went to Georgetown University and pursued a degree in a master's degree in religious studies. A good friend of mine who was the officiant at our wedding told me when he was in divinity school, one of the things that was important for him was that school didn't teach them what to think, but rather how to think. And that was something that was extraordinarily important for me in my studies and religion, not necessarily to understand what to think on all these subjects, but how to think and where to turn and find the answers. And that's something that's suited me well in my pursuit of covering the news and doing it as well as we can. As it relates to religious liberty and religious freedom issues that you're here talking about at this conference, there are no shortage of them in the news every day. One of the challenges and the differences between my work and what Emma does and what Liz does and the other panelists is I'm on right now. The broadcast media does not necessarily have the same luxuries of time and space. Cardinal Dolan, I'm sure, can tell you of all the times where I've hammered his press secretary, Joe Zwilling, trying to get him on 10 minutes ago to talk about the latest issue that came about. There is an immediacy to broadcast media in the now, and that's something that's critically important for us to communicate things. When a Supreme Court decision comes out, it's having done our homework in advance. I always get that tight feeling in my chest in the month of June that maybe some of you do as well in this room, where you're not sure which case is coming out today, but you know it's going to be one. You don't know if it's yours or the one that's going to matter, but you know you've got to get ready and be on your A game for that. That understanding those interconnections between religious liberty and the law, understanding how those work, understanding who the players are and what their roles are in those stories has been something that I've focused on a lot. I can't wait to hear more from the panelists. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. And let's keep going.
Well, thank you to everyone, and thank you for those remarks. I certainly echo what Eric said. It feels a little uncomfortable that my children aren't running in the background. I almost want them superimposed or something, having been on Zoom for the past year. So just to tee it off, I think really interesting discussion. We've had a few comments about sort of the tension or skepticism that some have felt toward the media. So just as kind of a first question, how can individuals in this room, attorneys, people from faith communities, be helpful to you in your role in the media? And we'll just ask that to everyone and sort of go down the line, and we'll reserve Elizabeth for last. Go ahead, Gretchen.
I think that religious groups have a really great opportunity when talking to media to really present their case well. I mean, I'm in this weird position of being in both worlds, right? In the world of the media and also in the world of the church. And so religious groups, I think it's incumbent upon them to really put their best foot forward when communicating their message. This is really, really essential because, as Eric just mentioned, and I nodded because I really believe it, I think people talk about bias. It's not necessarily bias or that people are out to get the church. I mean, some are, but it's not necessarily that. It's a lot of times it does come from ignorance or just a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding of nuance. A lack of understanding of a particular perspective. And so that's where I think religious groups can really help get out in front of the story and help communicate really well. I think it's why dioceses need excellent communications directors to be able to talk about the issues in a way that the media can understand and help kind of shape those stories. I also think it's really important for religious groups to put their really excellent experts forward. The church operates within its own particular law in the Code of Canon Law. And so I think for religious groups, again, speaking specifically for the Catholic Church, to have really excellent canon lawyers be available to talk to the media, to discuss some of those nuances and perspectives, really important. So I think it's really incumbent upon the church to really be good at selling its message. There's two particular ways that I want to talk about real quick, if I may, about how I think the church has done this effectively in the past. One has been the Catholic Voices Initiative that really seeks to help train Catholic communicators in doing just what I said. And the other is this really great initiative that's at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome called the Church Up Close, which happens every couple of years. And they invite reporters, journalists, secular, religious, whatever, from around the world into the Vatican, like literally into it. I went maybe 10 years ago. And they are underscoring the importance of really bringing the media into the world of the Vatican. I mean, you go into the dicasteries, you speak with the key players, and he really brings a broader understanding of the church and its role and it's what it's trying to accomplish. And so I really think that those are two really significant ways that the church can go about really communicating well its mission.
Very good. Thank you. Emma, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'd offer a couple comments. The first echoes the sentiment that Gretchen was expressing, which is to engage. And this seems like a simple piece of advice, but there, I think, are many players, whether it's a Catholic diocese or a law firm, that don't feel comfortable engaging with the press, sometimes based on grievances that are legitimate and understandable, a feeling that they're not going to get a fair shot, or that the questions the reporter has are completely off center of what the real topics are. But in general, I think that journalists are people. I don't just think that journalists are people. And it's really important to try to reach out to journalists and to try to engage in good faith with journalists when they seem genuinely curious about the issues that you're working on. Because when journalists like me or Elizabeth, whoever, don't have that engagement, then we have to kind of work around the edges. We have to kind of deduce things and talk to other people and figure stuff out around the edges instead of actually just talking directly. And I personally think that it's always just better to talk directly to the principals involved in a case or a controversy and hear directly from them rather than trying to tell the story by doing a runaround, which is what we have to do when people don't engage with us. So that's number one. The other thing is just talking about sort of sourcing and what's valuable to me with sourcing. I often find that especially religious groups or people who come from a certain part of the religious world, they have a complaint, which is, why doesn't the media tell stories about all the great stuff that the Catholic Church is doing? Why doesn't the media tell stories about, all the ministries that the Southern Baptists are doing for immigrants on the border? We never see these stories. It's all about conflict and culture war and fighting. And I think there's legitimacy to that. I think the media can sometimes have too much of an addiction to fights that are predictable and wear the ruts in old controversies. But on the other hand, I think there has to be a certain amount of realism in understanding that our job as reporters, especially people who are working in national newsrooms who are serving both secular and religious audiences, is to be guides and translators to big questions that are not intuitive to all of our readers. In other words, it's my job to help somebody who doesn't understand anything about Catholicism to come to a story about a fight over the Eucharist and to be able to actually read the story and understand it. And it's my job to serve the Catholic insider and try to put new information on the record about that same fight over the Eucharist. And so with this job, our role is not to sort of highlight all of the beautiful, inspiring things about humanity. It's to really try to look directly at the facts of things that are happening in our world and make them more intelligible. So all of this comes back around to sourcing. The people who I find myself relying on most consistently and who I find to be most valuable are able to understand that and speak directly to it, to understand what the multiple points of view are going to be on a certain issue, to speak frankly and directly, even if it's off the record or on background, and to really be willing to kind of see problems as they are, and to help me understand it both from their perspective, but more broadly, as kind of navigators themselves. So I think that's a really important value to the media. and something that I think not a lot of people understand in terms of how the press operates.
Okay, thank you. Eric, you talked about ignorance being part of the problem. So how
Yeah.
can we help dispel it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple things, both on a practical level and on a more important level. I think a key thing you've heard so far is relationships. Relationships matter. There are not that many reporters in this country who are focusing on this as a primary focus. You can get to know them. Their email addresses are publicly available. You can reach out to them proactively. But in my case, specifically when these cases are getting to be, let's call it breaking news territory, when it's going to be one of the top stories of the day on one of the national broadcasts, I can't start at 10 a.m. when the Supreme Court issues its opinion. That's too late for me. I'm behind the 8 ball if that happens. So having those relationships built in advance and being able to understand things prior to when the news happens goes a very long way. And so to have those conversations on background or off the record, say, hey, I don't understand this. Can you help walk me through this and help me understand it? That's really, really critical. And I would say practically there are a few things just from a broadcast standpoint. Get a little media training. That doesn't hurt. Invest in yourself so you can understand how to deliver the message you want to say concretely. The average soundbite on NBC Nightly News is about 10 seconds. So can you make your argument in 10 seconds? I know you had a lot longer before the Supreme Court to make that argument, but I needed in 10 seconds to understand for the viewers. So that's a real challenge, and that's an art form, and you can learn how to do that. The other thing practically you can do is you can learn where the nearest TV station is for you to run in and do an interview if CNN needs you to be on TV. You can buy a nicer microphone for your laptop so that if NPR calls you, you can sound great on the radio. If you're doing an interview with a print reporter, you can record a note on your phone, an audio note, so you have a recording of what you said in the event their recording fails and they are in a jam. And that way they don't have to interview you again, which I am telling you because it's happened to me and it's super embarrassing. So you can bail them out, and you can also hear how you delivered your message and sort of judge yourself and go back and review it. So I think those are helpful things. And most importantly, when you see my phone number, pick up the phone. Text me back. That's really important because, like we talked about the immediacy of broadcast versus what Emma and Liz are doing. I mean, they both write a lot on breaking news too, but chances are I need somebody in the next hour or less. So if you see somebody like me calling you, you can call me before Liz. That's okay. She has a later deadline than I do.
False.
With that, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'll just take the microphone with that. Yes, when the New York Times needs a comment, they probably need a comment too, because we're also changing the format. You may have noticed all of our live briefings that we're doing. So you're getting the immediate news as it's happening, and then we'll build that out throughout the day, and you'll have then your story likely on A1 the next day, but online is instant. So can rival my cell phone for Eric's or anyone else's. But I would really echo these points about building relationships with reporters. One of the most valuable things to me is, and I realize this takes great patience perhaps on many of your parts, but I will be following probably what you're working on, even if I'm not writing about it. And so, I'm thinking right now of a wonderful attorney who's been on a case for several years, and she updates me, I don't know, like every 4 months or every 6 months, just so I know what's going on. Because I know this might not be something I'm covering right now, but it's part of major trends that are happening in the country. And I either may need to do some feature about it later or know how it's fitting in with other things that are happening. So I can see, okay, I know this is happening in Indiana, and I know this is happening in California or in Florida. How do these things come together for a national story? And also then being willing to share like what meaning you make of what is happening too, because then I can start to see, okay, I see these people understand the significance in this way, and other people that I can sort of triangulate it and understand to try to put the whole together for the whole range of readers that I am writing for. And one really practical thing that hasn't been said yet, at least for me, I am trying to make sure that the voices that I'm quoting in my stories, both on Deadline and on feature stories, represent the range of voices in this country. And that includes people who, for a variety of differentials in power, don't often get quoted. So I am very aware of, are all the voices in my story white? Are they all men? I mean, I that can't be the case. That can't be the kind of story that I'm doing. So I have been very grateful to people who I will call and say, hi, like, I know that you might be the official, like, or you might be the spokesperson, or you have been for this, but who else should I hear from? Because it's important to get Black Americans and Asian Americans and gay Americans. I mean, just like there's a whole range of voices. And one of the functions of how especially religious structures have worked is that it's mostly men who routinely will answer the phone or want to be the ones who are quoted. And it's often white people. And so it's an extra level of diligence that I think a lot of my colleagues are trying to pursue. And you all can be very helpful in that. And I know that may mean or may be perceived as giving up power, or it's like, and this may not be in all of the cases. I mean, this is something that isn't true in every case. I mean, obviously, if there's like a lead litigator or something like that, like who is a white man, I would like to talk to him. But it's just something that I and my editors and my colleagues are increasingly aware of, and it's helpful to think about kind of sharing who gets to speak for you and whatever it is that you're representing. Yes, I think that I can say.
Okay, let's put a even finer point on this. So I know that Latter-day Saints, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have are eager or desire for members of the press to use the full name of the church. And I caught wind from an inside source from the Atlantic magazine that at least one helpful reader decided to go back into the archives and collect 2 years and correct every instance of the name and send that in. That may fall into the category of an unhelpful example of trying to help the press. But what are, in this question, helpful ways that religious individuals, religious communities, religious attorneys, religious groups, what are things that they've gotten right in trying to be helpful? And what are some concrete examples of maybe things they've gotten wrong?
Good question. So, I think back, what have they done right? So again, my perspective from Catholic media, the Catholic Church, last summer we had a national reckoning about a lot of things. One of those things was on statuary and whether or not these statues, historical statues, should still remain standing, what it represents if they do, what it represents if they don't. And caught up in that debate over statuary, which I think is important to have, was the image, the statuary of Saint Junipero Serra, who was a Spanish evangelist, came over to California, created multiple missions along the beautiful coast of California. His statue started getting, I'm sure you read this in the news, started getting taken down, defamed. And I thought that the way that the church responded, in particular the bishops in California who were really on the front lines of this, Archbishop Gomez in Los Angeles, Bishop Barron in Los Angeles, Archbishop Corleone in San Francisco, I thought they responded really well. They came out really strongly as to the fact that Padre Serra had just been canonized by the church in 2015 by Pope Francis, the first canonization on American soil, and what it means to have mobs of angry people tear down this statue, and what it means for the church, what they're saying about themselves. And I thought they came out really, really strongly, really well. Bishop Barron, who has the media apostolate Word on Fire, approached it really well with a YouTube video. He was very clear, he's very gifted at that. Archbishop Gomez wrote a really beautiful letter to the faithful of his archdiocese. So I thought that they handled that really well and really clearly. It's very, very nice to see that. where the church has gotten it wrong. And I really hesitate to go down this path, but I think sometimes in working with the media, we all know that the church has sometimes gotten it wrong in clergy sexual abuse. And, I can say this, in my position, I agree with it. And unfortunately, it's very specifically a story that we follow very closely at our Sunday Visitor with the Diocese of Buffalo. They kind of had a meltdown in the past couple of years and ended up in the eventual resignation of the bishop that came a lot later than it should have. They had, whistleblowers on the inside, clergy and laity, lay groups who were calling for his resignation far before it came, as well as really persistent local reporting that I thought really helped kind of get the church to where it needed to be in order to move forward and to move past kind of the crisis that was happening there. So I think that was an example of where the church could have done a better job.
Okay. Emma?
I feel like I've been outed. I wasn't your confidential secret source, just for the record.
It wasn't, yeah, I didn't mean to suggest you were. I had another source from
That's
the
right.
Atlantic.
That's right. But I think I know who your source was. And I will say, just to out him, my colleague, McKay Coppins, who's a terrific writer and recently wrote, I think, a 9,000 or many thousands word feature on the LDS Church, which he is a member of, and his own faith and the challenges for the church moving forward, which I highly recommend to anyone in this room. One of the things he wrote in his story, which I got a good chuckle out of, which was that the LDS Church has recently asked reporters not to use the term Mormon for all sorts of reasons, and to use the full term either Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or LDS Church. And McKay, who is a lifelong member of the LDS Church, said, even me in my writing prowess could not figure out a way to make palatable the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on multiple mentions. So I bring this up because I thought it was funny, but also because I think it highlights a tension in the perspective of religious players and reporters, which is sometimes religious players think that reporters are not using their preferred terminology or their preferred name or phrasing things in a certain way because they're hostile to religion, they hate religious people, they're ignorant, they're bigots, whatever it might be. And sometimes it's just that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a mouthful. That's a lot of words to put on the page over and over again. And someone like McKay, he's not writing that or finding right-arounds to be hostile. He is trying to work within the imperatives of our form and to be fair all at the same time. That's kind of a silly example, but I think there are really high stakes versions of this. And just to make things exciting, I'll bring up the recent Bishops' Conference that many of us have mentioned and the arguments over a teaching document on the Eucharist. One thing I saw on Twitter from many, you might call them conservative Catholic critics, was basically saying anyone in the media who says that President Joe Biden is a Catholic is biased and incorrect, because clearly he's not, because he holds positions that are counter to the Catholic Church, and you can't be a Catholic if you hold these positions. And that's kind of an extreme example, but that's the kind of feedback where, as a reporter, it's just not going to fly. The President of the United States is someone who goes to Mass. He is someone who has talked about his Catholic education. We've got to work within parameters that aren't so thoroughly conditioned by the perspective of one side of a particular debate that terms become unrecognizable. So that's the example of, I think, where religious players sometimes get it wrong, is misinterpreting the demands of the profession of journalism, which include fairness, which include trying to make things intelligible to readers who are not insiders, in a way that they might disagree with or might sort of sit wrong with their perspective, but ultimately is reporters trying to do a good job of showing fairly a very complicated debate. Where do I think that religious groups have done it well? I think there are all sorts of examples of this, but the stories that I've worked on, which I've appreciated most, are where principals have been willing to talk frankly and honestly about conflicts that are really challenging, and to just be honest about the fact that those are complicated. I'm thinking of, for example, a story I did maybe 5 or 6 years ago about a certain conference within the Mennonite Church that was going through a really painful debate over the role of LGBT people in its membership roles and leadership ranks. And there were really sharp divisions within that conference over what they were going to do and who was going to be able to stay within it. And the thing that I loved about that story was that
they didn't try to hide or obscure the fact that it was painful and that there were really sharp disagreements. And there was a lot of vulnerability there. There was a lot of honesty in saying, I don't know if I can stay in a group with you if you hold this position or that position, but also I feel a lot of grief over this. We share a lot of history. We share a liturgical tradition. This story was so moving to me in part because after every debate, which was so painful and involved tears, the whole group would come together and sing in four-part a cappella harmony, these hymns. And so to me, that kind of vulnerability and honesty, I think really is powerful because it's true. I think those stories are the most true in the sense that in places where there's conflict, especially internal conflict, often it's a both and. It's a real hard disagreement, but also it's shared community and shared history, and being able to hold both of those things at the same time, I think makes stories more human and more honest.
Thank you, Eric.
I think I'd point to a couple of things. One is it's important to remember that our mission is to our audiences and to serve them. We talk a lot about that at NPR and being mission focused. And the LDS Church wanting to be called the LDS Church is a great example of that. If I only refer to that group in a piece, in a radio story, and a piece online as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there is a sizable portion of my audience who may have no idea who that is, but if I add formerly known as the Mormon Church, then suddenly they're clued in a way that otherwise they wouldn't have been. And so it's important for us to sort of find that balance. And we are working our hardest to get it right and to use terminology that people prefer, but there are some times where we come down on the other side of the spectrum. A good example of this is at NPR, there was a sizable debate about what to call the groups who refer to themselves as pro-life and pro-choice. And you notice in a lot of major national news publications, they do not use those monikers when they are referring to those groups unless it's in the title of the group. They'll use abortion rights opponents or abortion rights supporters, because we feel like that is the most accurate way to describe a group, even though that may not be, in that instance, what the group prefers to be called. In the event they're trying to use their name as a cudgel against someone else. So trying to be clear to our readers as to what this group is and where they stand, and help them understand that's an important distinction we have to make. In terms of examples of what's super helpful and what's not, in terms of what's not, I always like to say, to use a biblical phrase, let your yes be a yes and your no be a no. Do not string us along. If you can't do an interview, I get it. But don't say maybe, 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 and then flake in the 11th hour. That's really unhelpful to us and a disservice to the millions of people who listen to us. I'm not saying that's happened with anyone in this room. I'm just saying, of the things that really fire me up and make me upset, it's when we're 5 minutes before air and somebody says, oh, I can't make it. And then suddenly we have to really scramble. And that's something you can easily avoid.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Before we give Elizabeth the last word here, I'll just say we're coming up to the end of our time, and I've been instructed to urge everyone to move rapidly to the ballroom at Morrison for our next session, which is a keynote session. So we want you all to be there. So make sure you can pack up your things and move there in good time. So we'll give you the last word, and then we'll thank all of our panelists.
Well, thank you. Some of my very practical advice has been eloquently articulated just now. Two other things. I find it so valuable when religious groups or anyone really will talk to me just on background. I mean, I sense that there's a lot of fear in general about the media and being the fears from being misquoted or not understood, or you just don't want to. I was, to take a Notre Dame example, I was so grateful to all kinds of sources who spoke to me on background or totally off the record even, as we were getting ready for the Supreme Court appointment of Justice Amy Coney Barrett, just to be able to help me make sure that I knew, I had a good sense of what is real, what is not real, just to better inform my reporting. And I work with great colleagues and peers, both at my own outlet and others, and there's a lot of really good faith actors. The point, at least, in my journalism, the point is not gotcha journalism. The point is to get the story right. And so I'm very grateful when people will go above and beyond to try to help inform the reporting and trust me with that. And on opinion stuff, this is totally separate, but I do get a lot of requests like, hey, can you help me place my op-ed about X, Y, and Z? And I can't do that. It's not what I do. I'm a news journalist, and most journalists, in the news, there's the newsroom and there's the opinion pages, and it's, total wall. Please write to them, talk to them about it. There's, instructions on how to do that. But yes, like there are plenty of ways to share your perspective. It's not my job. And just sort of on this topic we've been talking about the relationship between religious groups and the quote unquote media. I guess I can just say it sort of bluntly. People don't agree about what truth is, and religious groups, have had the kind of role that they've had in humanity for thousands and thousands of years, in part because they conserve tradition, they conserve like an idea about what truth is, what humans are, what God is, who God is, how people should and shouldn't act in the world, and that is. I think there's been this undertone sometimes in how we've been talking here about, the media needs to, if we just truly understood, then we would quote, get it right. But I think we can't skirt the fact that the idea of somehow, sometimes religious figures that I talk with will never think that I get it right, because they will have a fundamentally different idea about what truth should be. And I think that this conflict is getting worse in this country. I mean, I'm not, this is not a positive note to end on, but this polarization is really real, and it's really troubling for me and to other people who cover what is real, because we can't agree anymore on like what something that even happened or didn't happen even existed. I mean, it's like we're on different planets of reality and delusion about this. And so I think we are in a time like everyone here does such stories with such empathy and compassion and really good faith actors. And yet I am very aware that we're at a time when, and believe me, I hear about it on every story from every angle, no matter what. I have a giant inbox of everyone saying something completely different about the story. But we're at a time when no matter how honest and fair and empathetic and multi-perspective and complicated and nuanced I can make a story, people may not recognize themselves. And that may be what is one of the most real things that is happening about the state of the country right now. And so I guess I'll leave you all to enjoy talking about that wherever you're going next, is break out and discuss. And I would love to know what you think about it, but I wouldn't shy away from that as a thing. I mean, I think we can all deal with that kind of conflict and still have really positive working relationships and trust one another in that. So thank you again for having us all.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And let me just say that to Elizabeth's point with regard to having empathetic, nuanced voices with regard to religion, these panelists exemplify that. And one way to support that, one way to support their influence in newsrooms and elsewhere, is to subscribe to their publications. And I was rooting around for my copy of The Atlantic that I read on the way over, but of course the New York Times as well, our Sunday Visitor and NPR. So I want to commend all of these panelists and thank them for their time today.
As a business manager at every one of our shops is
Oh,
thinking,
yeah.
please subscribe. Please donate and subscribe. The end message always